Welcome to our last lecture, Art Between World Wars. And we will be looking at modern art in America. So we had the first glimpse into these new ideas of Impressionism, or brought about by Impressionism, when James Sutton brought Impressionism to America, 1886. At this point in Europe, it had pretty much failed. This was his last big haul to try to gain back some of the financial investment that he had poured into the Impressionists. And this helps to open the doors for challenging new ideas in modern art in America. But when we're talking about modern art, we really need to talk about the Armory Show in 1913. So yes, this takes place before this unit between World Wars, or post-World War I through World War II. But it takes a little bit of time for these new ideas and this new art to acclimate. So it comes about, like the ideas come about between these world wars. So the Armory Show, again, we are separated from Europe by a huge ocean, where before these quick plane flights. And so these ideas aren't coming in the same speed that they are in Europe. They aren't spreading as quickly. So this is really America's first glimpse into many of the new styles that we talked about that were challenging the academic style. So here's some of it's International Exhibition of Modern Art, Association of American Painters and Sculptors. And so there are artists who are really interested in these new ideas and they want to show the public. And of course, there's major controversy. Think of with the Impressionists, before the Impressionists, where we have the realism artists such as Manet, where he introduced his Sunday lunch, Le Sunday, and how it was part of the Reject Salon, and how more people attended this controversial Reject Salon than they did the official Academy Salon. And so here we have this Armory Show, which shows all these modern sculptures and modern art that we've now become familiar in this course, but this was brand new to many of to much of the American public. And so it was controversial. Some of them were just as equally as shocked. There were many critics about this artwork, but it was the first exposure. And so it takes a little bit of time, but then these art movements really take off and these styles help Americans to also challenge the norms of art. And so we're going to talk about Marcel Duchamp again. So you may have thought he only made ready-made sculptures. Nope. He dabbled in other new styles such as Cubism. So this is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. And this one was very controversial. I think one critic described it as, like roof tiles, chaos of roof tiles or something like that. So it's heavily criticized. Consider how many female nudes we've looked at. Such an icon of art. And here we have Nude Descending a Staircase. This cubist female coming down the stairs, but it's hard to tell that this is a figure. There's not really any elements of a figure throughout this painting. And so this was shocking, and this was seen as the epitome of modern art and the culmination of all these critics rejecting these new styles. But of course, this opened up the art world. And so in 1913, the Armory Show was America's first big interest in modern art. And so then we have some modern sculpture that comes around. So this is Alexander Calder, Lobster Trap and Fishtail. You have an assigned resource over this. But here we have a very different sculpture than what we've ever seen before, right? So he first started with making these little wire sculptures, just bending wire. Had this circus thing going on, and he'd create these little circus elements made out of wire. And he keeps experimenting, and he creates the mobile. This is a new term. He invents it. And it moves around. There's this sense of it's dynamic. It's not static like what we think of with the sculpture. And so it challenges the notions of art, of sculpture. What is sculpture? Why isn't this a sculpture? There's no figures here. There's no storyline. There's no subject matter. It's purely painted sheet aluminum and steel wire. And it also moves. So it challenges all those notions and all of our ideas about sculpture. He's known for his mobiles, but he's also known for these giant steel sculptures. You'll often see his work or copycats of his works outside of office buildings. That's where I think I've seen the most, or some office and whatever big office building in these big cities or in other areas have purchased or patronized his artwork. And here we have Jacob Lawrence, The Migration of the Negro, panel number 49. So I want you to take detailed notes over the article over this. I like the explanation. And today you have a new video, or two new videos over the Harlem Renaissance, as well as we are now in the era where we are hearing directly from the artists. We have a video of Jacob Lawrence speaking about this artwork. So we're going to see a lot more of that, where the artists are telling us, and we have recordings, we have their publications of what their artwork is about. So Jacob Lawrence moved to Harlem. So the Harlem Renaissance, I'm going to summarize a bit, but I do like that assigned resource video, is this borough in New York City, like a neighborhood, where historically it was primarily an African-American borough. Now, from what I understand, it's been pretty gentrified, but initially it was mostly African-Americans moving here during the Great Migration, looking for new opportunities after our Reconstruction era. And so how do I begin? It becomes this cultural center of new ideas. Like, I truly believe that New York today, when you hear New York, you think of it as like this art center, Broadway, music, the art world, modern art. If you want to pursue something creatively, then you're going to be moving to New York. Or fashion. My sister's a fashion designer who lives in New York. And all of that really begins with the creative ideas of the Harlem Renaissance, of these people from different areas in the United States coming together. And much of it is defined by jazz, by the new jazz age. And so jazz originated in New Orleans, and where you have freed slaves and sharecroppers who are essentially getting together and just jamming out. Like, jazz really originally sounded you're just jamming out. And so that music is brought up to New York City during the Harlem Renaissance. And this is also a time period where we have all of these new goods. We've talked about these industrialized ready-made goods, factory assembly line, and this involves records. And so lots of people are able to suddenly afford record players and records. And so then you have these new musicians in Harlem who are recording these records, and then jazz just spreads like wildfire. And it completely challenges music. So I hit a little bit on that with Vasily Kandinsky and how there's new music being brought about. And jazz music is completely brand new, and it just blows people's minds. It's so different than what was before. And then you have new dances, and this is also such an epicenter of new writing, where you have writers who are creating art, creating literature that hasn't been done before. You have artists who are creating You have Langston Hughes, he creates a whole new type of poetry. So before, when you think poetry, it's very academic, where you'd have to learn about it in a class to be able to interpret it and understand it for much of the poetry produced before this time period. And so you have Langston Hughes, this artist who creates this poetry, and he uses vernacular that anyone can understand. He uses phrases and terms and talks about jazz and boogie woogie and really good poetry that's available for anyone to appreciate, all different walks of life. And so this epicenter of Harlem really creates the foundation of New York City as we understand it today. Opens up this place of creativity. And so we'll see later how New York becomes the center of the modern art world. And I firmly believe it's because the Harlem Renaissance opened all of this up. And so we have Langston Hughes as one of the great writers, amongst many, many others. This is where we have like Louis Armstrong and other musicians who are here. And so we also have Jacob Lawrence. So Jacob Lawrence moves here as a younger man. And he creates this panel, so this series. What you'll notice, and he talks about this in his video, is the common colors throughout it. And so I want you to watch that video to see his explanation. But he creates this series where he's explaining the Great Migration. Panel number 3, from every southern town, migrants left by the hundreds to travel north. Food had doubled in price because of the war, 1940 to 1941. The labor agent recruited unsuspecting laborers as strikers for northern industries. So these men are being taken advantage of, where they think they're signing up for a new job, but they come in and they're just what they call like scabs for the strikers. And so they're heavily criticized once they get there. Or the migrants, panel number 45. The migrants arrived in Pittsburgh, one of the great industrial centers of the North. This is during the Steel Age. And so notice how with the text that he creates, it reads like a textbook. It's very objective, but yet the images are infused with emotion. But in look at the composition in the usage of color. We don't have this shading. We have these solid blocks of color and that are complementing each other, but it's still infused with this emotion. We can feel look at the position of their bodies where there's this struggle going on. And so you're moving with the anticipation of new opportunities and how there's this sense of hope and they're unfortunately being taken advantage of. And then the excitement of arriving in this new industrial city where we're going to be able to have these jobs. Female workers were the last to arrive to the North. So really common in history, the males or the husbands or the dads would move first and then establish themselves and bring the family up and over across the globe with migrants. And then you have our panel that we're going to use for our exam image. They found discrimination in the North. So there was this idea that, these Jim Crow laws are only in the South. And even when you're moving up to New York and elsewhere, there technically aren't any Jim Crow laws. But look how far it extends up until Pennsylvania, which we just saw a panel about. But there's still discrimination. And so we see this bright yellow zigzag line separating Caucasian from African Americans. And so there's this great sense of disappointment. And he continues this series, and it's inspired by the Harlem Renaissance. It's inspired by the Great Migration. He often attended lectures. He was very knowledgeable on this subject and did research on African American history. So he's not just speaking from experience. He's very well researched and knowledgeable in the subject matter. And so he depicts this unexpected prejudice that African Americans faced when they moved to these northern states. Again, this bright zigzag. So make sure to take notes over the article over Jacob Lawrence, as well as his video where he speaks about this series. Okay, our last work during World War II, we have Edward Hopper, the Nighthawks. So the Nighthawks, as you can tell, is relatively similar to some of the other artworks that we've studied since the late 19th century. So I want you to take a moment, consider what the message or meaning of this artwork could be. Okay, so he too is reacting to these big lonely cities, right? A few decades later, half a century later, but we still have similar reactions. He even recalled one time, he talked about how unconsciously, probably, I was painting the loneliness of a large city. So he may not have intended to do that, but it comes out anyway. We know that this is a city, but it's empty. And yes, it's at night, but we'd still assume that there would be people. And even these 3 individuals who are seated here, they aren't interacting with one another. There's this sense of loneliness. We also don't see the entrance to this cafe. So there's this sense of entrapment to an extent. It's this all-night diner. These were really common. The server seems to be asking what they would want, but the actual customers who sit at the counter seem to be lost in thought, or they're disengaged with one another. There's no debris in the street. There's no sense of people that were here. And so there's this sense of loneliness, but then it's not this dark painting. Yes, there's these greens, but there's these harmonious geometric forms throughout it. And this calming green that we see here. And so apparently this is inspired by a real restaurant that he had seen in Greenwich, or on Greenwich Avenue in New York City. But it's not a realistic depiction of any particular place. But we as the viewers are left to think about the figures, their relationship, this imagined world. And we are during World War II, so there is this sense of despair. We had recently entered it, less than a year before that. And so we see this reaction. Now, again, we don't see many artworks during World War II because so many people are off at war, and females who are home are taking care of business, etc. But we will see a huge boom after World War II with our next, did I say one? I meant two. Anyway, we'll see a huge boom of modern art and new ideas after.